Hey, I'm Nathan Cole. You'd think having billions of dollars would make life safer, but for the billionaires in this video, their wealth did the exact opposite. From a real estate mogul who ignored landslide warnings just to impress a rival, to a billionaire who locked away his own life-saving medicine behind a system even he couldn't access. It was February 17, 2016, in Aspen, Colorado. 3 days of rain and melting snow had saturated the mountainsides surrounding the valley, but the party continued inside a hillside mansion overlooking the town below. Guests gathered to celebrate an expansion project, while the ground beneath them quietly weakened. The mansion belongs to Arthur Vance, 57, a guy who absolutely refused to lose. He made his millions turning impossible mountain plots into massive luxury estates. People called him relentless and competitive, which, to me, Arthur seemed like someone who was always looking for a bigger challenge, even when the risks were already well understood. Every house had to be bigger, every success had to be loud. His original mansion had been built on stable bedrock and was considered one of the more technically impressive homes in the area. Building on a cliff requires careful engineering. Rain, loose soil, and shifting rock can put enormous pressure on foundations. Done right, a structure can last for decades. Done carelessly, it can become a disaster. Everything changed when a rival businessman announced plans for a larger estate on a nearby ridge. Determined to outdo him, Arthur ordered a rushed expansion that included a glass viewing wing, an underground garage, and a rooftop terrace overlooking the valley. Several engineers warned the project increased the risk of instability, but Arthur pushed ahead anyway. Construction crews soon reported unfinished drainage, water seeping from the hillside, and cracks appearing along the access road. Despite worsening weather and concerns from contractors, work continued. Arthur wanted the expansion finished before his rival's project stole the spotlight. On the evening of the unveiling, he hosted a private hard hat dinner inside the unfinished glass wing. Rain hammered the structure throughout the event, while guests gathered around temporary tables overlooking the valley. Arthur spent much of the evening pointing out the expansion's features and comparing it to the rival estate he intended to surpass. Several attendees later recalled feeling subtle vibrations beneath their feet. Others noticed glasses trembling on tabletops and ceiling fixtures shaking slightly overhead. As the evening went on, the mountain began dropping hints that it was about to give way. Several guests noticed doors sticking and thin cracks spreading along the floor-to-wall joints near the outer edge of the wing. A few even joked that the floor felt slightly tilted beneath their feet, though most dismissed it as normal settling in an unfinished building. But outside, the situation was spinning out of control. Security cameras caught waves of thick mud sliding down the slope, while retaining walls began to buckle under the weight of the saturated soil. Inside, the cracks near the support columns began to visibly widen. A few guests quietly headed outside, but Arthur remained inside, assuring others that the movement was nothing more than settling in an unfinished structure. Witnesses heard a loud crack before the floor suddenly dropped. Tables slid and glass shattered as the wing tilted toward the mountainside. Guests rushed for the main house as rain and debris poured through the broken windows. Surveillance footage later showed the entire addition tearing away from the mansion. Steel supports twisted apart as the structure slid downhill with tons of mud, rock, and concrete. Arthur was still inside when it collapsed. Emergency crews arrived minutes later, but heavy rain and unstable ground slowed access to the debris field. Search teams worked through the night before locating Arthur's body beneath collapsed concrete and steel. The coroner determined that he died from catastrophic crushing injuries to the head, chest, and torso. The force of the collapse caused unsurvivable trauma almost instantly. Months later, investigators completed their findings. They concluded that a combination of unfinished drainage systems, prolonged rainfall, aggressive excavation beneath the slope, and the added weight of the expansion destabilized the hillside and triggered the collapse. Ironically, the original mansion remained largely intact because it had been built on stable ground and followed the original engineering recommendations. Arthur's company quietly dissolved in the years that followed. The damaged remains of the expansion were eventually removed, and the unfinished helipad was demolished. Today, the original house still stands. To me, there's something deeply ironic about that. The part built with patience survived. The part built out of rivalry didn't. Arthur never made it out of that collapsing house. But honestly, The next story is even crazier because the guy actually had a local guide begging him to turn back, and he still walked straight into a bear feeding area. It was October 8, 2015, on Kodiak Island, Alaska. Freezing rain had been falling since dawn, turning game trails into mud and covering the valleys in dense fog. Local guides were already cutting hunts short and heading for shelter. But one hunter wasn't interested in turning back. Garrett Vail was 49 and worth hundreds of millions from a hedge fund empire he'd built over 2 decades. Online, he portrayed himself as a rugged outdoorsman, but people who worked around him often saw something different. Garrett genuinely enjoyed the outdoors, but years of success had also convinced him that difficult situations could usually be solved by spending more money, hiring better people, or pushing harder than everyone else. In reality, his wilderness trips were luxury experiences with cooks, satellite internet, and local guides handling the hard work. That morning, Garrett was hunting a legendary Kodiak brown bear to celebrate a corporate takeover that had added billions to his fortune. When his veteran guide warned that freezing rain, rising water, and poor visibility made the hunt too dangerous, Garrett refused to call it off. According to investigation reports I've read, he repeatedly pushed to continue despite the guide recommending they head back to camp and try another day. As the afternoon wore on, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Recovered action camera footage later showed rain streaking across the lens, while strong winds drowned out most conversations. GPS records revealed the pair repeatedly drifted off their intended route as visibility worsened. Investigators later concluded they had unknowingly moved into an area several local guides typically avoided during bad weather because dense vegetation and poor sightlines made surprise encounters with bears more likely. Down by a salmon creek choked with thick brush, Garrett spotted movement through the fog. He thought he'd finally found his trophy. What he didn't realize was that he had just walked straight into a Kodiak brown bear's feeding area. The weather made everything 10 times worse. With the heavy rain pouring down and the roaring sound of the rushing river, neither Garrett nor the bear had any idea the other was there until they were standing face to face. Then, the attack happened in a heartbeat. The brush exploded just 30 yards ahead. A massive Kodiak brown bear burst from the tree line and charged. The animal covered the distance so fast that there was barely time to process what was happening. Garrett threw up his rifle and fired a panic shot, but between his slippery boots and the fogged-up lens, he missed completely. The guide immediately began shouting and trying to position himself for a follow-up shot, while Garrett stumbled backward onto the rocky bank. The bear slammed into him like a freight train, knocking him off his feet and sending his action camera flying into the mud. The video cuts out there, but the audio kept running. Investigators later recovered the tape, which captured the brutal sound of the entire struggle. It lasted less than 60 seconds before the bear vanished back into the brush. For me, this is the hardest part of the story. Just hours earlier, Garrett had been warned that the conditions were becoming too dangerous to continue. Instead of listening, he pushed ahead anyway. Now he was lying on a riverbank with catastrophic injuries. The bear had crushed his ribs, fractured his skull, and torn open a major artery in his thigh. He was bleeding out fast. The guide desperately tried to direct rescue teams in, but the storm grounded every emergency helicopter on the island. A ground crew had to hike in, taking 2 agonizing hours to reach them. By the time they arrived, Garrett was already gone. When investigators later reviewed the GPS tracks and witness statements, they found something that really stuck with me. The guide had repeatedly suggested turning around earlier in the day as visibility continued to deteriorate. Had they done so, they likely would have avoided the creek altogether. Garrett spent his life believing that money, high-end gear, and sheer confidence could conquer anything. But standing in that freezing Alaskan rain, none of his millions mattered. Nature didn't care about his net worth. As tragic as that was, our next story takes that same arrogance in a completely different direction. Instead of trying to conquer the wild outdoors, this billionaire brought the danger inside and ended up building a high-tech trap he couldn't escape. It was June 12, 2017, in Palm Springs, California. The desert heat was finally easing after a 104-degree day, and guests were leaving a private investor dinner at the sprawling Crane estate. At the center of it all was 61-year-old Elias Crane. The guy was a pharmaceutical titan who built an empire around specialty medications, ironically, including anti-venom. He was brilliant, demanding, and utterly obsessed with control. But here's the flaw with guys like Elias. Massive success often convinces them that safety rules are just for the less capable masses, not for them. Beneath his Palm Springs estate, he built a climate-controlled reptile facility filled with some of the world's most venomous snakes. It featured reinforced enclosures, emergency medical equipment, and handling protocols created by reptile experts. Those protocols required protective gear, proper tools, and at least 2 people present whenever a snake was handled. Elias rarely followed those rules. Earlier that night, he'd been showing off his collection to investors during a private dinner, bragging about his experience. Security footage later showed him returning to the reptile room alone, just after 10:30 p.m. His prized possession was a rare Russell's viper housed in a custom enclosure connected to his private study. The snake's venom can cause severe swelling, tissue damage, and clotting disorders that lead to internal bleeding. Multiple employees later said they had warned Elias about handling the animal without proper equipment, but he continued doing it anyway. Investigators believe he opened the enclosure that night, intending to handle the viper. Evidence showed he reached directly into the habitat as he had done before. The snake delivered a single bite to his hand before he jerked away and slammed the enclosure shut. And here's where things became much worse. Several months earlier, Elias had ordered all of the facility's emergency anti-venom supplies moved into a biometric security vault located down the hall. Based on reports I gathered, he was worried about theft, improper handling, and potential liability issues. The vault was designed to protect expensive medications and biological materials, but it also required a lengthy security release process before anyone could access its contents. Former handlers later told investigators they strongly objected to the arrangement. The estate's anti-venom supply was the only species-specific treatment immediately available nearby, and obtaining additional doses could take hours because local hospitals did not routinely stock Russell's Viper anti-venom. Elias ignored those concerns and approved the system anyway. After reading the report, this is the part I literally cannot get over. The fastest source of the exact medicine he needed was sitting less than 100 feet away, but he had personally placed multiple security barriers between himself and it. Hallway cameras captured Elias stumbling into the corridor moments later, clutching his injured hand as swelling spread through his fingers and wrist. Investigators believe he attempted to access the vault himself, but the security release process prevented immediate access to the medication. Over the next hour, security footage showed his condition steadily deteriorating. The swelling moved up his arm, and he became increasingly unsteady before eventually collapsing near the vault. A security guard monitoring the cameras called 911. Paramedics arrived quickly and transported him to the hospital, where doctors consulted poison control specialists and began supportive treatment while trying to obtain anti-venom. The problem was that the nearest confirmed supply of Russell's Viper anti-venom remained secured inside the estate. Specialists contacted exotic animal networks and specialty providers, but obtaining additional doses would have taken significant time. Despite treatment, laboratory testing showed the venom had severely disrupted Elias's clotting system. Internal bleeding developed as multiple organs began to fail. He died a few hours later. The coroner determined that widespread clotting failure triggered massive internal bleeding and organ failure. Investigators later concluded that the estate's anti-venom supply would have been available far sooner than any replacement source. When technicians finally opened the vault, they found the anti-venom sitting untouched inside. To me, that is the ultimate cruel irony of the whole thing. The exact safeguards Elias trusted to protect his stuff ended up blocking the one thing that could have saved his life. If you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to subscribe, because the next story takes that same obsession with control in an even deadlier direction. It was February 18, 2014, in Big Sur, California. Days of winter storms had soaked the coastal hills and triggered small mudslides across the region. Late that afternoon, a wealthy landowner walked alone across his property. The man was Nolan Pierce, a 54-year-old tech investor who made hundreds of millions buying and reselling software companies. He wasn't famous outside business circles, but people around Big Sur knew his name. After purchasing a large stretch of coastal property, Nolan spent years restricting access, installing gates, fences, and surveillance systems that repeatedly put him at odds with local residents and county officials. A few years earlier, Nolan purchased a remote coastal valley and transformed it into a heavily secured private estate with cameras, fencing, and steel gates. He also closed off an old access trail despite objections from county officials who wanted to keep it available for emergencies. That morning, Nolan decided to inspect storm damage alone. Despite warnings from his security staff, he headed into the steep, rain-soaked terrain, carrying only a phone and handheld radio. By mid-afternoon, another storm system rolled in from the Pacific. Security cameras later captured Nolan walking along a narrow maintenance path above a drainage channel. Investigators determined the saturated hillside had already become unstable. Then, everything went wrong. As Nolan crossed a muddy section of the path, the ground suddenly collapsed beneath him. Instead of a simple fall, investigators concluded he slid down the unstable slope, striking rocks, exposed roots, and drainage structures as he tumbled roughly 25 feet downhill. When he finally came to rest at the bottom of the embankment, his injuries were severe. The slide had caused an open fracture to his lower right leg. Bone fragments from the break tore through surrounding tissue and damaged the popliteal artery behind his knee, one of the major blood vessels supplying the lower leg. He was bleeding heavily. Instead of calling 911 immediately, Nolan contacted his private security team by radio and phone. It was a decision that would cost valuable time. His staff initially attempted to reach him using internal access roads, only to discover that a mudslide had blocked the primary route leading to his location. Once security realized they could not reach him themselves, they called emergency services. Search and rescue teams arrived approximately 23 minutes later and immediately began moving toward Nolan's last known position. But they quickly encountered another problem. The fastest access route was the old service trail that crossed Nolan's property. However, the entrance was secured behind one of his reinforced steel gates. Storm damage had disabled part of the electronic access system, and the only manual override device was being carried by a property manager who was stranded on the opposite side of a mudslide. Rescuers considered alternate approaches, but each would add significant travel time across unstable terrain. Crews ultimately used cutting equipment to breach portions of the gate and fencing system. The process delayed access by roughly 35 minutes while Nolan continued losing blood. For me, this is where the story becomes almost impossible to ignore. The very barriers Nolan spent years building to keep people out were now slowing down the people, trying to save him. By the time rescuers finally reached the drainage channel, Nolan had been trapped for well over an hour. He was conscious only intermittently and showed clear signs of severe blood loss and shock. Paramedics immediately began treatment, applying tourniquets, administering fluids, and preparing him for air evacuation. But the delay had already taken its toll. Nolan lost consciousness shortly after treatment began and suffered cardiac arrest while crews prepared him for transport. Despite resuscitation efforts, he could not be revived. The coroner later determined that the fall was survivable. The fatal injury was the damaged artery, compounded by the delay in receiving medical care. Following his death, portions of the property were eventually reopened to allow emergency access through the area. Several of the barriers Nolan spent years building were later removed or modified. Nolan's obsession with locking people out killed him. But the final story is the ultimate example of control going wrong, because this next billionaire tried to lock out medical science, trusting his own expensive wellness hype till it was too late. It was November 19, 2018, in St. Moritz, Switzerland. Outside, fresh snow covered the mountains. Inside a fancy glass and marble wellness clinic overlooking the valley, rich investors were gathering for a private dinner party. The owner was 58-year-old Julian Vale. He was worth billions after building a massive medical investment company. For decades, his job was funding medical tech and drug startups. And friends later said that level of success changed how Julian approached obstacles. According to several family members, he eventually believed no challenge couldn't be overcome if he was willing to spend enough. Unfortunately, cancer wasn't interested in negotiating. Personally, I believe for most of his life, that worked. If a rival got in his way, he bought them out. If rules slowed him down, he hired pricier lawyers. He stopped seeing boundaries as real. To Julian, rules were just things for regular people, and wealth could beat anything. But then, that arrogant mindset followed him into his own doctor's office. A year before that dinner, doctors found an early-stage tumor on his pancreas during a routine checkup. Now, pancreatic cancer is terrifying, but catching it at an earlier stage generally gives patients more treatment options and significantly better odds than most pancreatic cancer cases, which are often discovered much later. His doctors strongly recommended surgery and conventional treatment as soon as possible, but Julian said no to all of them. Instead, he decided to spend millions creating his own cure. He built up his luxury clinic, hired his own private researchers, bought experimental gear, and started this extreme wellness routine full of special oxygen therapy, massive amounts of supplements, and intense fasting. Employees later admitted that the actual doctors at the clinic knew this stuff wouldn't stop cancer. But here's the problem. Nobody wanted to argue with the guy who signed their paychecks. To me, that is exactly where having too much money becomes deadly. Most people who refuse cancer treatment eventually have to face reality because they run out of options. But Julian was so rich he could build a whole fake world of doctors and machines just to tell him he was doing great. Over the next year, his scans showed the cancer was spreading fast into his liver. His doctors begged him to go to a real hospital. Instead, Julian just took those bad results as a sign that he needed to spend more money on his wellness clinic. He even started bragging publicly that standard medicine was old-fashioned and that he had discovered the future of health. That investor dinner was supposed to be his big moment to prove everyone wrong. Julian was walking around under big crystal chandeliers, talking about opening more clinics. Guests later said he looked incredibly thin and kept stopping to catch his breath, but his ego wouldn't let him stop. Then, right in the middle of his big speech, Julian froze. He grabbed a chair, bent double, and threw up a massive amount of blood right onto the floor in front of all his wealthy guests. It was absolute chaos. A few doctors in the crowd ran to help, but get this, Julian actually argued with them. He didn't want to go to a real hospital because he wanted to stay inside his own clinic to save face. By the time the ambulance got there, he was in terrible shape from the blood loss. They rushed him to a real hospital, but it was already too late. The cancer had extensively damaged his liver, disrupting normal blood flow through the organ and creating severe pressure within the veins connected to his digestive system. Over time, enlarged veins had formed in his esophagus and upper stomach. One of those veins ruptured during the dinner, triggering the catastrophic internal bleeding that everyone witnessed. Julian went into cardiac arrest a few hours later and died. Following his death, the clinic's experimental cancer program was quietly shut down. The treatment Julian spent years promoting had failed to stop the disease that ultimately killed him. When the whole investigation wrapped up, one detail stood out to me above everything else. The medical files showed that Julian had the best specialists in the world offering to save him on day one. He had more access to top-tier healthcare than almost anyone else on Earth.